With growing attention on rare earth and critical minerals, what are they and how do they impact everything from our daily lives to the military? Joining us to unpack all this and the geopolitical implications is Tomasz Nadrowski. He is a portfolio manager at Amvest Terraden Critical Minerals Fund and author of Mineral War, China's Quest for Weapons of Mineral Destruction. Tomasz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as we've been seeing, stocks are going up and down with, all the developments with rare earth, critical minerals. What even are these? Let's just first dive in. What is a rare earth?
Rare earths are 17 different chemical elements that tend to co-occur together in subsoil in different parts of the world. And the main problem is that unlike other elements that we can just simply mine, like copper or iron ore or gold, we tend to extract all of them together. And the biggest problem is how to separate those valuable ones from those that are less valuable. And that's the big problem for the industry.
And then when it comes to critical minerals, there's a lot of minerals, so what makes a mineral critical?
So certainly what doesn't make them critical is geology, because rare earths can be found in many places. What's critical is control, and who controls the production and the extraction and the processing of these minerals. And there's one country that controls it, and that country is controlled by one party, and that party is controlled by one man. And therefore, that's pretty critical when it comes to control. And that's probably what matters these days more than geological occurrence of these minerals, of these elements, or even the processing capacity that's being rebuilt in the West.
I want to get into all that, but first for, say, the average Joe on the street, why should they care? How do rare earth critical minerals play into everyday life, but also our military?
It's very important because the main application for rare earths is in permanent magnets. Now you may say, why do I care about permanent magnets? Well, because about 60% of our electricity uses magnets, and 70% of those magnets use rare earths, which means that almost half of all the electricity that we use is dependent on rare earths, mostly because of electric motors that contain those. So imagine that someone could basically switch off half of our electricity. That affects all of us. Now, it's not going to happen for the existing infrastructure, but also means that you cannot build anything new, whether it's infrastructure, industry, or of course the military.
We saw that not long ago with Ford when they had to stop production of a whole range of electric vehicles or EVs because of supply chain disruptions in terms of that. You mentioned earlier, right, there's a huge control by one country, one party, one man. I want to get to that, but first there's a couple developments because it seems there's realization about that and the concerns there. We saw President Trump launch something, a $12 billion project called Project Volt, which is to stockpile critical minerals. What's your reaction to that, and can these rare earth critical minerals be stockpiled?
Yeah, so these are two different questions. The first thing, I think it's an important step forward. A stockpile is not a solution to our supply problem, but it's a buffer for demand. It creates sort of a monopsonic, oligopsonic structure to protect the industry downstream from potential restrictions on the flows. And so it's important, it's also very important that business has been harnessed to create this project and co-invest with the Exim Bank. But it doesn't solve our supply issue. There is also the second part of the question, whether you can actually store them. Yes, you can warehouse certain forms of these minerals, but not others. And what does it mean? It means that they have to be in a form that's thermodynamically resistant, that's resistant to oxidation, and that's chemically inert. And that's not all of them. So for rare earths, it will be, for example, oxides. Otherwise, it's going to degrade over time. Gallium, which is very important also for semiconductors and our defense, would probably melt in this temperature here. And so it's very difficult to store some forms of these elements. And therefore, the stockpile has to be moved all the time and replenished anew.
Another huge development, as you saw, Secretary of State Marco Rubio have something called the Minerals Ministerial, where he was meeting with delegates from 50 different nations, basically creating either bilateral agreements or boosting deterrence and reliance within these areas instead of, say, on China. How are you reading that? How successful could this be?
So this is too early to say how successful it will be. It's an important step forward because unfortunately, America won't be able to solve this problem alone. It's something that's been festering for 3 or 4 decades now. deindustrialization and loss of the mining industry as well. And we are not the only country confronted with the restrictions of the dominant producer. Right now it's Japan, sometimes it's Europe, sometimes it's the United States. And each of the US allies have different strengths. So coordination is really important. Say we have the largest capital market in the world, $72 trillion worth of equity market. So it could be infused partly into this sector. It's not the case right now. Japan and Korea have viable refining industry, and Australia and Canada are very strong mining countries. So together, we represent a very important power to actually rebalance that production away from the dominant producer right now. But it will also require coordination and action, and not just talking about it, because this is not the first initiative like this. In 2022, the Mineral Security Partnership, MSP, was launched also by the US, also with the G7 members and other partners and allies. A year later, at the G7 meeting in Karuizawa in Japan, there was an important meeting, and nothing much has happened, partly because business hasn't followed or was not incentivized to properly follow and help governments to solidify this coordination into something that's really viable from the economic perspective.
I think that's a great transition now to how we got here, right? We're seeing these different movements. So how did we end up here where China has essentially monopolized this entire sector? What was China seeing? What did China do to become the dominant player here?
So to get into this in detail, I'll have to send you to my book, but let me just very briefly say that probably it's our own fault that we didn't pay attention to the structure, economic structure of imposed on China by the Chinese Communist Party. And that's a structure that's essentially Marxist. You have to control what they call means of production. So essentially different parts of the economy, which are critical, not only for national security, but for the economic control. And that has been done by operating in upstream sectors. The upstream sectors were never privatized, whether it's basic chemicals, mining and metals that concern us here, whether it's banking, telecom, oil and gas, or power generation. That stayed in the hands of the state, and the state could therefore control input prices for areas which were more liberalized, especially in the 90s and early 2000s after China joined WTO. And so mining and metals were part of that scheme. And the second thing is that generally totalitarian regimes care a lot about metals. Because when you think about metals, you think about defense and potential, kinetic conflict and so on. So they viewed these minerals as a strategic asset, whereas in the West, we view them as a commodity, something that we can trade.
I think that's a great point, because right now we're seeing the stocks go up and down with all these headlines of different, new initiatives and all of that. But you talk about in your book how, the Chinese Communist Party really sees regime survivability as its main thing, and that feeds into everything it does, right, when it comes to rare earth or minerals, because this is a high-risk industry. So, we're not seeing the U.S. or normally our allies invest a lot in these areas because it is high risk. So how does the way the Chinese regime view the markets, if you will, because it is very different, how does that feed into what we saw with these industries and how they were able to cement their power through that? Right,
so a very good point about high risk. High risk requires high return, but you cannot generate a high return if the price of a product is too low. And China, by building this amazing overcapacity in many sectors, but let's focus on this one, has a capacity to produce too much. There is not enough consumption, there's not enough demand domestically for these, and therefore the prices of these materials are way too high. However, we should not be too concerned about prices in, say, Ganzhou in Jiangxi province. We should be concerned about prices here and the structure of demand and supply here, domestically or internationally. And unfortunately, it was not possible because we didn't generate any volumes to have price discovery. Therefore, capital didn't follow, it didn't invest in this space. So hence the problem of overproduction in China and underproduction, or sometimes zero production in the West.
I want to dig into that because you have some examples in your book, Mineral War, which is pictured right here, where you talk about, going to different mines in different countries and seeing how the locals deal with it, maybe people who love geology deal with it, and then how the Chinese dealt with it. It's very different. So maybe break down some of the examples there, and then we can dig a bit more into your book.
It is actually a very interesting contrast when you travel, to Africa, parts of Asia, Pacific, or South America. Mining industry in the West is structured in a very specific way. To find something, there will be a number of entrepreneurs who will raise money on stock exchange in Australia and Canada and just then go and explore and get to know the locals and trying to manage the expectations of the locals, because of course not every project will become a mine in future. In fact, there's probably a high probability that most of them won't. And so that is the first process, and then you need to move this process to bankability, to find that these are resources and like turn into reserves and attract capital to eventually build a mine and produce. That's not how the Chinese system functions in those other jurisdictions, because they have a very strong tendency towards vertical integration. But if not vertical integration within one company, which sometimes happens, like in lithium, then within sort of an SPV, so special purpose vehicles that travel together and are able to reduce the risk of the operation in an exotic jurisdiction. First, because the Chinese government looks after them through initiatives such as FOCAC in Africa or China cooperation in Latin America. So the jurisdictional risk is lower. And then those operators usually move to projects that will have lower risk because the offtake, the future production is already secured, the market is secured by the local Chinese bank, by the local Chinese refinery. And so they don't have to go through all the process that a Western company has, being exposed to massive risks, including jurisdictional risks and other security risks. So this is a big change, because then you can value the projects in a different way depending on what the level of risk is.
I want to dig into that, because in the book you also tie it with China's global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So they go into a country, they're like, maybe we'll build a road or something, or a bridge or a train track. But alongside that, they tag on the mineral projects, whereas in the West, it's like you have one person go in and try to gain all the capital that you're talking about just to get the mining rights. So talk about how that difference plays into what we saw essentially with a lot of Western firms or even allied ones giving up their shares to the Chinese.
Yeah, the system you mentioned is called Resources for Infrastructure. I think it was inaugurated in 2007 in one of our African countries, where you have completely unrelated infrastructure project that's offered by a state-owned enterprise in China, hugely over-levered back home, but that's immaterial. It's a strategic project. It's a strategic project of important diplomatic weight, but there's also a question of valuing the mining project that piggybacks on that broader scheme, where usually the future value of the flow of material back to China is undervalued compared to the value of other projects that are associated with this. And there are a lot of, say, African researchers who found this mismatch. It's not so difficult to figure it out if you can get hold of the numbers. So it's a different scheme. There is no state-owned enterprise in, say, France or Germany or Japan to go and build an unrelated, stadium or a dam just in order to be able to extract copper, cobalt, or lithium from some country.
On that note, how does geography and all of that play in? Because, people talk about rare earth, maybe aren't that rare. We have some in the US, right, different areas, but we're not really mining them or refining them, the more important part, right, the processing afterwards. So how does all of that play into what we're seeing now?
Yeah, so I think this term rare earths is very confusing for most people. In an article the other day, I even saw someone calling it so-called rare earths. Indeed, some of them are not rare, but others are rare and are difficult to extract. Right now, two heavy rare earths that are very valuable for us for high performance magnets, not least for the military, almost non-existent on the western side of the divide, of the strategic divide. There are two plants only, one in Malaysia and one in Estonia, and the one in Malaysia just started in the third quarter of last year to produce one of those called dysprosium. The first couple of tons came out in the third quarter, a little more in the fourth quarter. So there's hope, but it makes this particular heavy rare earth rare. And so we cannot be so obsessed about the ubiquity of these deposits in the ground. What matters is actually, can you separate the oxide, metallize it, produce a magnet for everyone to enjoy.
Give us a sense right now, what does the market look like, right? Because a few years ago when China decided, it wasn't going to export germanium and gallium, a lot of industries, especially in the US, were very taken aback by that, because basically it seems it's only from China. So give us a sense, how is China dominating?
We're certainly not out of the woods yet. The best example is current Chinese embargo, near embargo on exports to Japan. And Japan is a very big consumer. After all these years, 15 years of efforts by Japan to become a little more independent of Chinese exports, on the magnet side, Japan has been roughly successful, but it's still about 30% of their demand is satisfied by imports from China. On the oxide side, it's a little more. And so right now, we know that some of the producers of electronic components, mostly B2B electronic components in Japan, are beginning to question whether their inventory will be sufficient to continue production, because China is currently basically going back to their usual book and is restricting exports, in this case just to Japan, not to the entire world. So that is an ongoing problem, and even Japan, which has definitely done a better job than other Western countries in terms of becoming independent, still relies on a lot of these inflows from China.
I want to dig into that because Japan was the case that really caught, I want to say, the world's eye, right? I want to say back in 2010 when China, for the first time that the world saw, weaponized an industry and withheld rare earth or critical minerals and really stifled Japan's economy growth in many areas because it was basically leading the US at the time. So what happened there and what were the lessons from that?
There were several lessons. The first one was the one that Japan learned and quickly invested in several stages on the production side, starting with a very important Australian company that they recapitalized and basically saved from bankruptcy at some point, and then also establishing metallization plants in Southeast Asia, and also a very strong e-waste, so recycling process. I think Japan is more advanced than other industrialized country on that side. On the other hand, China also learned a lesson, because when the prices spiked back then in 2010, and the government was willing to, continue this embargo, we don't know how much longer, there were smugglers. And smugglers managed to actually leak this material to Japan, and the prices slowly came down. The Chinese Communist Party does not like when market decides. Smugglers are a market, if you like it or not. And the effort for China since then, over those 15 years, was to tighten the system so that the leaks can no longer occur. And today, this is a much tighter system. There used to be hundreds of small operators in the southern part of the country. Today, just about, most of the industry is consolidated in just 3 major state-owned or state-controlled companies with very significant separation capacity. And it's because there are quotas that China offers to different producers. Basically, by offering quotas to those 3, other producers had to either go out of business or were acquired by state-owned enterprises. So the control is much tighter today. So it's not like over those 15 or 16 years, China has been sitting idly and waiting for the West to catch up. That's not what happened.
And why has Communist China focused so much in this sector? What would happen, say, if a kinetic war were to break out over Taiwan and the US gets involved? What would the world look like in that stage?
I would not like to contemplate that, hopefully. But let's not forget the general obsession of Stalinist systems with metals. You might remember Mao Zedong and his backyard steel making, right? That led to a massive famine in China. So this obsession about metals and metallurgy is not new. Not in PRC, not in USSR before, not in Nazi Germany. That's what these regimes really do. And so there's a very strong focus on these industries. Meanwhile, we focused on trade and markets, and this was just one of many hidden in the corner of the capital markets.
Right now, though, we're also seeing, at least the past couple of years, a huge focus on, say, so-called green or clean renewable energies or electric vehicles. Obviously, now there's a lot of talk about AI, and a lot of that needs these types of minerals that China has somehow, right, monopolized over the years, or the West didn't realize that. So how does the future look if this is the direction? I know we're talking about, the 50 delegates at the U.S. today. Trump's trying to stockpile. There are moves in the direction to kind of reduce the reliance on China. But if it's still the status quo right now, what does that kind of growth look like?
I wouldn't be very optimistic right now. We are still way, way behind. And let's focus. It's the batteries. It's new energy technologies. It's semiconductors. It's robotics. It's defense systems. It's data centers. Everything that's today and tonight and the day after tomorrow depends on these minerals. So somehow we missed that mineral moment in our technological development. Hardware is so important. Right now we're seeing this in the market. Software is going down. Maybe we won't need software with all the AI, but we will need this 3D little piece, even if it's small like in Taiwan or larger somewhere else. We will definitely need that. And without those minerals, we won't get there.
Talk about the time it would take to launch something like this in other countries. What does that look like?
Yeah, so generally it takes a very long time from the moment you find something in the ground to build a fully fledged operating mine, up to 15, 16 years. Now we don't have time for that, but because we can harness those resources, you mentioned 50 countries that just joined the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Interior and other members of the administration in Washington today. That's a very positive signal. But it's a signal, on the one hand, it's a pull factor of the US momentum to find policies that would help us solve this problem, but it's also a push factor because someone else is showing, if we want, you will not get any. So it's alarming. It's alarming because of the level of dependence that we have, and I would hope that because total independence is probably unlikely to happen overnight, that in alignment with our allies, we'll be able to actually find solutions, harnessing this power of our capital market to redevelop it much sooner. Because those 16, 15, 17 years that I mentioned include also a lot of permitting, time wasted on permitting, or not wasted, but definitely there are maybe ways to accelerate the process. And putting together the value chains between different components of the broader Western Alliance and countries that would like to be part of Western Alliance and sometimes called Global South, that would definitely help us accelerate that. But it has to be, we have to go beyond just talking about it. There has to be real action now.
How does, because you mentioned permitting, right, and all of that, how does the environmental factors play in? Because it does seem, right, in China, they're opening new coal plants. A lot of that is actually to do all these green or so-called energy things that they then ship abroad to other countries that are following, emissions standards and all of these different things. So what does that playing field, if you will, look like right now? How is it different in China versus the West?
Let me be very blunt. Mining is not benign. Okay, you're making a big hole in the ground and then you extract something, not necessarily pretty, it's noisy, it's dusty. But you can manage all of these things and you can return this ground to its status quo ante. That's possible, and there are measures and procedures and systems right now that allow Western operators to do this. You're right that Chinese industry started in a very different place, and for a long time there wasn't much concern about environmental spillage. The largest rare earth mine in the north in Neymongoro is an example of that, right? But I think it's not in the interest of the Chinese to have their own environment damaged to this point either. So I think their industry is also slowly learning. I'm not sure to what extent this is applied overseas, but at least to mines in China, a little more than in the past. Having said that, the approach that some anti-mining groups have, that we just don't want this, right? This is a dirty industry. We don't want this hole in the ground. I always ask them, well, do you all live in tents or do you live in a building or a house? Because that also starts with a hole in the ground. That's not very constructive. We need this industry because, by the way, everything here, unless it was grown, cultivated, or farmed, or maybe made from oil and gas, otherwise it was mined originally. So we cannot function without mining, and yet we outsource our mining, and then we outsource our industry, and we are left with just designing things. That's not sufficient, especially not when the world has moved from this globalized competition into a different social operating system, which I call conflict. That's what it is, and that's why a different way of functioning is necessary, and we have to pay more attention to what we actually do and how we foster development again, including industrial development.
I want to get to the conflict part, but very quickly, because there's a big focus on, say, wind turbines, electric vehicles, now robots, right, who maybe take over. How much minerals do all of these sectors need, though? Because often people think, oh, these are clean, right? So how dependent on minerals are they?
A lot. All of these elements you mentioned, wind turbines, very heavy in rare earths, batteries, of course, a lot of battery materials. These are minerals, both on the cathode side and anode side. An electric vehicle has about 8 times as much by weight of critical minerals than a old ICE, internal combustion engine car. And it's the same with many of other technologies. In fact, as we're moving forward, the technologies become more hungry for minerals and more different minerals, including those small specialty metals that we never think about. When Intel came with Intel Inside in 1990s, there were 17 minerals inside that. Right now, in your computer is going to be probably 75 or 80 different minerals on the table of elements. That's quite extraordinary. That's where we're going. And semiconductors is the same story. So whether it's the green transition sector or other sectors, there's definitely the complexification of our technology has brought that demand on a much broader basis than before. And the same also affects our military.
It's a perfect transition, because I want to move now to conflicts, because how does this fit into our military, say our fighter jets? We see a lot with the B-2s with, say, Operation Midnight Hammer in Iran. Of course, there's the Venezuela operation recently. There's always the concern around Taiwan or in Asia. How do all of these play into that realm of conflict? And if conflict were to play out, what would happen?
So again, I hope the conflict won't play out, or if it does play out, then it ends with a quick solution of a maneuver, because an attrition war right now is not in the interest of our deficiency in this space. A prolonged attrition war. We know it. We know what happened during the first 3 years of the Ukrainian war, where a lot of our stockpiles were also almost emptied in certain materials. So there's definitely a problem here. I think that what's more important, that we have to remember that the civilian market in times of peace is always much larger than the military market. The military market is mostly state procurement, and yes, granted, it's growing. Look at the budgets in Germany, in Japan, Australia, and India, and the United States as well. But it's still much smaller. So here I have to give credit to the administration for thinking about civilian stockpile, because that's what the new measure is. We've had a military stockpile, the Defense Logistical Agency, which under different names exists since the times of FDR, President Roosevelt. But this is the first time we have a civilian stockpile, which is much larger. And this is an important buffer. It's like a shock absorber that we need just in case, because we need also civilian industry in times of conflict, not just the military.
And right now, because these are dominating headlines so much, it seems like your book came out in the perfect time. So talk to us a bit about what made you write this book, and did you time this perfectly?
Yeah, exactly. That's precisely what I tried to do. I think I've been working in minerals in general and mining for very long time, decades now, and when I started looking at these specific sectors, the smaller sectors, the specialty metals, the battery materials, the rare earths and others, I noticed something. I noticed their importance was structurally growing, and sometimes exponentially. But the awareness of that was not there. Not in the market, when I talk to other market participants, not so much in the media, not among policymakers, until very recently. So what's changed, and that's about the timing you're mentioning, is that we're no longer ignoring this problem. I was aware of this maybe a little earlier because of the nature of my work. And so it struck me that we generally, as general public, we don't recognize that it's not visible in our consumer products, but it's there. It's inside most of them, and in many other products, including for defense. So it's absolutely critical that we have access to these, and we cannot allow just one player, no matter which one, but just one single player to control it. It's a bad idea to put all your eggs into one basket in general, and it's worse if this basket is controlled by someone else who's not interested in commercial success of those eggs inside this basket, but has other rationale.
And on that note, what would be the solutions here? What are the next steps needed to start moving away from having all the eggs in that one basket?
So I love music on vinyl. I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but the record says capital market has to follow. We have to incentivize somehow by a tax system, by price floors and maybe reference prices, and then protect those reference prices with tariffs so that private capital really participates in rejuvenation of that sector. Because right now this is not the case. Right now, unfortunately, it's still a very marginal piece. So our administration really cares a lot about artificial intelligence and critical minerals for good reason. But artificial intelligence dominates our equity market largely, right? The top 7 companies that wouldn't exist suddenly, you ask about Taiwan, wouldn't exist anymore if we lost access to foundries in Taiwan. These are the top 7 companies, that about a third of our capital market. Critical minerals, not represented there at all. Tiny companies, by comparison to the others, improving a little bit since last year. There's a little more attention to this, but less than 1% of S&P 500 is represented by mining companies. And it's such a critical industry. So we have to do something, as I said, maybe through the tax system, maybe through coordination with other countries, to incentivize more investment into this space, and sooner rather than later.
On that note, given that Japan was kind of the first example of the shock, right, of China weaponizing an industry, what lessons can maybe the West learn from Japan? Because they have reduced their reliance on China, not completely, but they have, diversified different ways of recycling as well. Are there lessons we can learn?
Yeah, so obviously Japan is one of those countries of the Western Alliance that have never lost its manufacturing. Like Taiwan and Korea are two other examples. We have been much more deindustrialized, we here in America, Canada, US, Australia, and so on. So that's the first, maybe the starting point was a little easier for Japan. But they thought about it as a value chain problem. So not just mining, or not just refining, not just separation or magnet making or metallization. They thought about it as an entire ecosystem that has to be rebuilt. And that's exactly the approach we need, although we might need it across the borders of different allies. That's probably going to be very difficult to just rebuild it in just one space in one location because of different constraints, and there's a certain path dependency in development, industrial development. But we have to think this way: what fits what, in order to speed up this process. And these maybe Japanese lessons are worth watching.
Right now with Japan, we're seeing they're like mining in the seabed and the mud for some critical minerals. What are you watching in that sphere, and maybe could we see that elsewhere?
This is an excellent example how far or how deep certain governments will go to look for a solution to this problem. And Japan currently is unfortunately yet again confronted with the problem of the Chinese embargo. So it's an interesting timing for that particular mission. The vessel is called GQ, which means Earth, and has been around since the year 2000. Started actually as a seismological center, research center. Everybody who has been to Japan has seen this as a maritime country. We've all had sushi. They focus on their ocean. This particular vessel was looking for methane hydrate, which is a form of natural gas that could completely redraw the global energy maps if this was successful. Now it's rare earths, and it's pretty far away from Japan proper, but it's in an area which belongs to Japan, Bonin Islands, so the second island chain, not far away from Palau and Guam, further down all the way to Papua New Guinea. Very interesting process. We had offshore oil drilling for a long time, but not for minerals. They use a new technology, sort of a riser system, that allows them to pump this mud, rare earth holding mud, hopefully without too many radioactive elements. This we'll see. This is now 1 month mission. They will return, and if this is really prospective, then I think mining could start, in a couple of months from now. Whether it's a lesson for others, it's certainly a lesson for others to co-invest with, Japanese technological excellence in this. But not everybody has access to these special economic zones, that part of the Pacific, which is particularly prospective here. So something to watch, and I think it's a testimony to the crisis that we're all going through, that this is how far certain countries have to go to look for access to these minerals.
And given all that you laid out, right, this impacts our daily lives, also our military, our security, our national security. What are you watching for in all the realms, whether here at home, with allies, or adversaries like China? What are you watching for next in this space?
So I would hope that this meeting in Washington does not lead to yet another meeting and yet another meeting. That there is really a framework put together, first to support prices within the alliance, and then protect the alliance with tariffs. Because if we don't do this, there are a lot of downstream operators that have become addicted to cheap products and cheap inputs from China, and that we have to prevent this. So it requires a lot of commitment, and maybe a structure that would make it easier also for cross-border investment. We are going this direction. There's a big Korean refinery that's coming to the United States to invest in our refining space, and we have to be cognizant of different needs and different strengths. So I think it's a work in progress, but I'm encouraged by the progress.
Well, Tomasz Nadrowski, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.